everybody to Sutton House and the Hackney History Festival, which is a month-long festival put on by the Hackney Society. So my name's Victoria and I'm really excited to be your compere for today. So without any further ado, I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Romany Reagan. And Romany is going to be talking to us about untold stories of women at Sutton House.
Yeah, so just a little bit about myself. So I was a research fellow here at Sutton House a couple of years ago. And the research I'm going to share with you today was for a project that unfortunately, due to heritage funding, hasn't quite gotten off the ground. But we're hoping maybe one day it might be able to be an exhibition we were going to have as an audio installation in the house of the untold stories that I've discovered. But I'm happy that now I can share them with you here for Hackney History Fest. So now I'm sure most of us here today who are coming to a history festival already know a bit about history and how it's reported, but I'd like to just sort of stress that the idea we have of history is that it's a set in stone collection of facts. But it's actually how history is reported is a lot of how we understand what it is that we have today. So the idea is that it's a collection of records. So someone had to write it down, deem it was important to have written it down, and then someone had to decide it was worth keeping. A bunch of subsequent someones, sometimes over centuries, had to decide it was still worth keeping until a researcher for the 21st century can pick up a piece of paper and go, this thing happened. So when we look through the past, we're basically looking through a little keyhole of just what the snippets that were saved. And the further back in the past we go, the keyhole gets smaller. And of course, when we research women specifically, the keyhole is quite teeny tiny indeed. Now, unless you were a duchess or you were arrested, history kind of didn't have time for you. But we have to remember that just because something wasn't important in the written record doesn't mean it wasn't important for the community at the time. And the lived history of these women meant that they were very important at the time, just because the snippets are quite scant. Now, that's the whole idea behind this talk, is that feminist history is not some niche subject. We are half the human population. We have been here the whole time. And feminist history is human history. Now, when I began this research, I was a bit surprised because I kind of did expect from the common narrative that the history of the house is a very important men and their wives, but actually the control of the house, I was surprised to learn, was held by women for much more of the time than we would have thought. So the house was originally built in 1535 by Sadler when we were looking at the ownership of these houses. So historic properties, the ownership is exceedingly complicated. So now you would have 4 tiers of ownership. You would have the lord of the manor, who owned just kind of the whole area. Then underneath that, any particular property was held by the copyholder. So there was only a copy because the original deed was held with the lord of the manor. And if you owned a house, you owned a copy of the deed. Under that, you would have a leaseholder who held a lease to the property, and they could choose to live there. Or if not, they would also then have a tenant. So when we're looking at who owned a property at the time, we're not going to deal with the lord because he just owned everyone and that's not really relevant to what we're talking about. So at any point in time, you would have 3 levels of ownership for any property of this size in the area. Now, I made a spreadsheet across the 3 tiers covering 500 years of ownership, and it's really, really teeny tiny, and you don't want to read it anyway. That's not the point. The point is that if you can see, it's not small, but see the areas in green. This is when a woman held sole control of the property for 10 years, for a whole decade. Though when the text is green, which you can't see, but with the text means they held it for part of a decade. Now, I've noticed some themes here, as I think you can even see, is that there's a lot of green in this spreadsheet. So the top 3 tiers, you copyholder, leaseholder, tenant, and sometimes women hold it for all 3. So you see the green going all the way down. That means that they were holding all 3 layers of ownership of the property at that time. And we also have to remember, once again, how records are kept. And that if there was a man, if there's any male relative, that would eclipse the name of the woman in the property record. It doesn't mean that she didn't have any control in running the estate. It just means that she wasn't on the official record. So if she had a son or a cousin or any male record at all, then her name would be erased. So the fact that these are women on record means the actual ownership and control was probably even more than this. So this was kind of my big surprising finding, was I couldn't believe actually that even in official records, women had controlling interest in Sutton House for far more than the official story was telling us. Anyway, back to the women. Let's start meeting them. That's setting the sound. That's why I feel this story is important, because actually it's a much bigger part of the history of Sutton House. This isn't like a niche side project. This is actually the history itself. So Ursula is our first woman that we're going to meet. Her name is Ursula Machell. She was born Ursula Hind in 1550. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a portrait of her, but these were her parents, and she was born in Cambridgeshire from Sir Francis Hind and Lady Jane Hind, and she was from Madeline Hall in Cambridgeshire, and as you can see from this beautiful photo, it's now a wedding venue. So they were a major landowning family in Cambridgeshire, and they had a lot of power, and this was going to come and serve her later with what happened with her dastardly husband. So she's risen above the mess of her life when she married this awful man, and they had 2 sons and a daughter somehow. Now, they got married in 1579, and she was 29 years old when she got married, and at the time that was actually quite late. And I think that might speak a little bit to how she handled this marriage. She was not a blushing girl of 16. She was a woman who was almost 30. And I don't know why she married so late. I can't find a reason why. This was her first marriage, so she wasn't a widow. But it does speak a lot to how she approached this marriage, that she was not young. So now she married a man named John Machell Jr. And so this is his second wife. His first wife was Frances Machell. And this poor woman, she died when she was only 26 years old when she was giving birth to twins. And she died right here in this house. And so far, she seems to have died without a trace. There are stories of her that one of the ghost stories in the house is that she wanders the halls in a flowing white gown looking for her lost babies. It's very sad. And the ghost story, honestly, is how she was in life. She's a ghost. I tried so hard to find anything about her. I desperately wanted to learn more. I could find nothing. So the research is ongoing. I'm very curious about her story, but unfortunately, all we have is the ghost story of her. But going back to Ursula, so now she's the second wife. So they were famous cloth merchants, and so that's how they made their fortune. And Machell Jr. was only 4 years old when his father bought Sutton House here in 1550. And that was actually only 15 years after the house was built. So it was quite new when they took residence. And so he grew up here from when he was 4. So now at the time, the house was known as Brick Place. But for clarity's sake, I'm going to call the house Sutton House going forward because it had many different names over the centuries. It only got the erroneous name of Sutton House in 1938 when the National Trust received it. It's not even an accurate name. I'm sure that's probably covered somewhere in the festival, but it's really funny that it has nothing to do with Sutton. But anyway, I'll call it Sutton House going forward just so we know what we're talking about. So his father died and he inherited the house when he was only 12 years old. And so in the 1590s, Machell was at the height of his power and his influence within Hackney, but already his financial troubles were brewing. So right after his marriage to Ursula, he started buying up property in her home area of Cambridgeshire. So in order to buy up these massive estates, they were huge, he started borrowing money from his neighbors here in Hackney. And one of them he borrowed money from was at 10% interest. And he also borrowed one of the men as well that he borrowed, and he put up Sutton House as collateral, by the way, to buy these extra properties in Cambridgeshire. And one of the men he owed money to was James Dean. So Sir James Dean became his lifelong nemesis. He owed him so much money, it's actually quite shocking. So now in 1596, John Machell Jr., so he borrowed £1,000 from Dean. And we have to remember that would be like borrowing £172,000 today from your neighbor. So in order to pay his mounting debts for all these properties that he bought in Cambridgeshire, he actually then had to start selling the houses he just bought to pay back the extortionate interest rate on the debt. So he basically dug himself a very stupid hole. So he had to sell Higston Hall, and he narrowly escaped arrest in London. And that was Ursula's last straw. She's like, no, this is the worst marriage in the world. And so her family stepped in. It was like, listen, we need to save at least Woodbury for her and her children. Like, we need to step in and help. So now her brother claimed that Machell had actually written Woodbury to her in a deed, but he didn't trust Machell to uphold this, because why would you? And so it became this family skirmish of trying to keep Woodbury for Ursula. So but he technically could claim all these properties because they were mortgaged to him. So Dean went to the house fully armed, and Ursula ran upstairs and hid with a servant, and he and a sheriff brought Ursula out of the house by force and kicked her out of Woodbury. So yeah, she can't live there anymore. Goodbye, Woodbury. So she had to then flee here to Sutton House. So now, at this point, it's now the year 1600, and this whole mess was finally taken to court. And Dean claimed he had a valid right to all these properties, which he absolutely did. But how did Machell retain Sutton House, even though legally Dean had a right to take it, and that was Ursula. So, according to council witnesses, Ursula, she snuck in the back door with a servant, and it was right through, I think, that door, where there used to be a door. It's into the kitchen. So right next door, somewhere here, somewhere along this wall, she snuck in at night with a servant. She went upstairs and she basically barricaded herself and said, "You are not taking my home. I am not leaving. No," and they just peacefully kind of squatted in their own house and said, "You cannot take it from me." And now this story was according to witnesses who were favorable to her family. But Dean, however, had a totally different story, that actually it was an armed mob who came with swords and they stormed the house and took it by force. So very, very different accounts of the same event. So where's the truth in between these two stories? And as much as I love the idea of Ursula storming the house with a sword, I think it's exceedingly unlikely that it was violent, because she stayed in the house for decades afterwards. And that couldn't have happened if she had taken it illegally and violently, I don't think. With her Woodbury house lost, and due to her husband's complete mismanagement of all their funds, she would make her last stand in Sutton House, and this is a place where she wanted to be safe for her children. And several years after all this, Machell's grandson, who was Stewart's first wife, Frances, remember the two boys she had, he said of his grandmother, Ursula, he said, quote, "She is kept from the sight of his grandfather and made even as a stranger to him and all his estate during grandfather's time of," quotes, "upheaval," which is a polite way of putting it. So from this family statement, we can get the impression that Ursula had nothing to do with her husband ever again. He didn't live here, so she kept the house for herself, not for him. He was not allowed to stay, and he had to go find lodgings elsewhere. And I think this tells us a lot about Ursula's character, that she actually, even though it was Machell who was born in this house and grew up here, it was Ursula who said, "I don't think so. I'm living here on my own, my children. You go sort yourself out." Now, when Machell was finally imprisoned for debt, which he was eventually, it had nothing to do with Dean, actually. It was that first neighbor that he borrowed money off of. So that guy that he had borrowed money off of, his son had inherited this massive debt. And he's like, "Well, I want to go collect." And so that's when he finally got arrested. So he tracked Machell down to the house where he was hiding. He was hiding somewhere in Hackney. I don't know where, but obviously definitely not with Ursula. And he was sent to prison. And prison did not improve his mood. While he was there, he kept Chancery Court applying and sending cases up, saying, "These are all my properties." He actually tried to say one of his own sons racked up the debts and not him, but the court didn't believe this. It was pretty obvious these were his debts, and even throwing his own son under the bus didn't help him out. So he was there for 6 years, and then when he was released from prison, he went to Woodbury, but of course not this Woodbury, somewhere else. We don't know where, but it probably looked like that. So now he died 12 years later in 1624, worn out with resentment and rage. And we can just envision him sitting there in his tiny tenement, counting up his miseries, estranged from his wife, estranged from his children, and just being a very sad man. But Ursula, however, she went on to live another 14 years here in Sutton House and completely free of her useless husband. So good for her. After that, she held on. And then after that, she decided in her later years to go move back with her family at Mattingly Hall, the wedding venue in Cambridgeshire. And that's all right. So nice soft landing for Ursula. Okay, so yes, while all this was happening, what was happening with the ownership of Sutton House? So remember, we have these multiple tiers of ownership happening. So Dean, he is the copy holder, but he's not going to live here. He has multiple properties. He's busy. So the copyhold then goes to Captain John Millward in 1627. So we're going back to Sutton House now. And so there's this huge shuffle, a complexity of the Millward family. They own the property and it gets complicated. And then there was also all these records were lost in a flood. summons a lot, I'm sure, if you're familiar with archival work, especially in cemeteries, which I used to, floods constantly. And then there was the English Civil War, tiny problems there. So we have a little bit of a hole in our story, but it picks up again in 1657 with Sarah Freeman. And this is our next heroine in our story. So Sarah took over the leasehold. Remember, that's the second tier down, a Sutton House. And this is the first time where it's not a family home. It is now a school for girls, or more rightly, a school for ladies. So now this is her ladies' school, which was known as the Ivy School. And she had this for an impressive 43 years until her death in the year 1700. So her story begins just after the English Civil War. And it was this very tumultuous period in England, when it was temporarily rolled over by Cromwell, and then there was a Commonwealth, and there was a monarchy, and it was all very a tumultuous time. So now Sarah had only had her school for 3 years when the political scene goes upheaval once again, and there's a lot of pushback against the unpopular Puritan laws of the time. But so who knows how much of it actually was impacting her house before, because all that tumult was happening, remember, down in London, but it affected the nation. And so we don't know how much of this was affecting how she ran her school, but it is a really important backdrop to the fact that she was running a school during this entire time. So to offer, but also too, I should say that in the 1670s, the neighborhood of Hackney became of national interest because suddenly there was this focus on women's education, what women's education meant, and these boarding schools that were right here were right in the center of that. So to offer some context as to why a girls' school in Hackney would be of national interest, I'm just going to give you a tiny crash course into the downward spiral of the status of women. So in the previous century, in Tudor times, education was considered a very good thing for women, actually. It was the reign of Elizabeth I, and it was expected that women would have a high education. So you're expected to have education in subjects like philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, physics, logic, and rhetoric. Now, of course, the caveat is that only women of the aristocracy were to receive this education, but also so only were men. So anyone in the general public would just not get much of an education beyond a trade. But also, too, the scholarship was expected to be kept to the house, to your family, for your private enjoyment. Unless you were royalty, you were not expected to publish papers on your work, but at least it was held up as aspirational. It was held up that if you were from an aspiring family, having your education for your girls was considered something that, even if you couldn't afford it, you wanted to afford it, it was considered a good thing. This did not last. With the dawn of the next century, 1603, so now we have James I after Elizabeth, and with the death of Elizabeth, we come to pretty much the end of the favor afforded to the idea of the educated woman. Now, the devaluing of women during the 17th century, it's a really swift downturn. And the first blow, came from the misogynist monarch, but the second came from Puritanism. And now James thought that women were a foreign species, and actually one he didn't quite like. But in addition to this, he was also a very paranoid man. So he published his own demonology. He thought there was a satanic conspiracy of witches out to ruin his reign. I have a whole talk with him on witchcraft, which I won't go into right now, but it has a huge reason why as well, during the witch trials of the 17th century, is also really was a blow to the status of women as well. So this is all happening at the same time that Sarah was her school. Another thing James I said, which is amazing, he said, to make women learned and foxes tame has the same effect, to make them cunning. So, yeah. Now, his son, the 23-year-old Charles I, takes the throne. And this might have seemed like a good thing. Because you wanted to get rid of fops. You wanted culture and you wanted poetry. But he also had his own brand of foolishness. And he thought he was an absolute monarch with a divine right of kings. So, yeah, no. He wasn't actually, the best one ever. So, of course, obviously, 1642, skirmishes, English Civil War, skipping ahead, blah, 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 Cromwell, Puritans also didn't have much time for the education of women. The problem is, too, they put in the idea of the Puritan family. So the father is the head. He will read the scriptures to you and the family. A woman was required to be able to read the Bible, and that was about it. So the Puritans did have an ideal that everyone, no matter what class you were, everyone should be able to read. And that is amazing. I will give them that. The thing is, the only thing you were allowed to read was the Bible. So you're kind of like, okay, I can read, but I'm not allowed to read anything other than the Bible. So that's more like propaganda than education. So we're not thrilled with those developments either. Okay, so Restoration. Now, many people probably weren't that thrilled to have the monarchy back, but they were thrilled to have the end of some of these Puritan ideals. So And they're ready for a change of mood. And he didn't disappoint. So with the restoration of the monarchy, there's more freedom for public revels. And while there's no place for women of intellect, particularly girls in education, there was this idea that at least you're going to have boarding schools for gentlewomen. And so that's when we finally get, sorry for the delay, back to Sarah. Because we have to remember, she's founding Scrim during this crazy, tumultuous time. She has the Ivy School. And so at the time, Hackney was a suburb of London, and it was high above the crush of the city smogs below. It was beautiful. It had clean air, large homes, orchards, and also, too, the Hackney Brook ran openly through it. You can even see, so sorry, I don't know if I can, yeah. See, so that's the St. Augustine Spire there. It's just behind us. And then here it is again. And you can see just how absolutely gorgeous it was here. And it was this idyllic spot. And so this is where they had all the boarding schools for the girls, because it was considered one of the most beautiful parts in the area. During the 17th century, there were so many girls' schools here in Hackney that it was actually known as the Ladies' University of Female Arts. And so despite the fame of these schools, no records of these actual schools survive. But in trying to gather specifics about Sarah Freeman's Ivy School, or even herself, nothing is mentioned. It's so frustrating. But we do have comments from others that give us a little bit of a peek into what it might have been like for her girls here at Sutton House. So Pepys, always verbose. He actually came here in 1667, and he knew Hackney well as a child, and he and his wife came up to see the famous church tower. And he confesses, though, in his diary, he says that that which we chiefly went to see were the young ladies of the schools, which of their great store, very pretty. Because Sutton House is so close to St. John's, we can assume that the Sutton House girls, Sarah's girls, were also the ones he came to view. And we're hoping, because he did come with his wife, that he was just looking at young girls studying in the sunshine, and it was just as innocent as that. That's what we hear. Right, so but what is this school? Well, it's essentially a finishing school. So ladies would be sent here to learn about dancing and embroidery and, maybe a little French if you're lucky. And the idea, of course, is that appearance and manners were what you learned in these schools. That was of paramount importance. And the main thing they were preparing you for was your proper job of finding a husband. So the Hackney schools became so notorious that they are lampooned in many restoration comedies. So the mention of these schools in these comedies actually makes them a mark of their importance, because the restoration comedies were making fun of anything that was of cultural importance at that time. And the fact that the Hackney schools were mentioned so often means that it really were sort of a national touchstone. So in one of the plays, you have a character saying, "Do you think my breeding inferior to yours? I'm sure I was bred in a very pretty dancing school hard by." And then Strick replies, "Your breeding, ha-ha. I'm sure my husband married me from the Hackney school, where there are a number of substantial citizens' daughters." And in William Wycherley's 1673 play, The Gentleman Dancing Master, Hippolyta's maid Prue pronounces ridiculously, well, young mistress, you were not at a Hackney school for nothing, I see, nor taken away for nothing. A woman may soon be too old, but is never too young to shift for herself." So the purpose of these comedies was to ridicule what was ever foolish or absurd in society. And the idea is that learning and ladies do not go well together, and they are something to be made fun of. So there were two kinds of learned ladies who were appearing in these comedies. So you had the young, lovely, wealthy girl who tried to get an education and realized she was a bit silly, and then went back to the hero of the story. And then you have the older lady who's past marriage age, who pretends to know about Greek and Latin and philosophy, but she mixes all the terms up and sounds like a fool. And the joke here is that women can't learn. So it's not that the education itself is poor. It's the idea that even aspiring to an education was something to be ridiculed. You are ridiculous, you're a clown. The idea that the girls would receive an education from early age, now, that was really early. I mean, they'd be sent to boarding school at 6 years old. And then they would leave at 16, but most of them actually left at 14, because the main job was, okay, you got a bit of finishing, now go off and find a husband. So now, from these social portraits, we can get kind of an idea of the kind of school that Sarah ran here at Sutton House, and also the lives of these young women who in these very walls were dreaming of what their lives could be. And the decades, including the Civil War and the Restoration, led to really huge social upheavals. And you can only imagine how scary it was to think of the world outside of these walls for these girls. And in the second half of the 17th century, though, we also have a lot of women doing things under the surface. So there's a lot of things that happen in a very compact period of time. So women are also publishing books, like Hannah Woolley, Hackney's own. She published a lot of books on women's. A lot of it was just kind of how to run a house, but it was amazing how prolific she was as one of the first women's authors, using her name to publish a lot of books here in Hackney. They were also joining trade guilds, and they were also petitioning and calling for change. So on one hand, we have the sort of foppish idea of what girls were like during this time, but we also can see the work behind the scenes that the adult women were doing as well. So now all of this may have had temporary results and didn't come to nothing, but it's here that we can see the origins of the women's fight for equality in the 19th century really had its beginning in the brewings of what was happening under the scene in the 17th century. So while the Restoration comedies showed women to be frivolous, that wasn't the whole picture. So just when the next century was beginning, in the year 1700, Sarah Freeman died after running her ladies' school for 43 years. But it wasn't the end of the school. So it went on to be run for another 41 years after that. And first by her daughter, Priscilla Story, and then a series of headmistresses after that, for an impressive total of 84 years that the school was run here. And so now the record's only listed as a school. It doesn't say if it stayed with the name Ivy School or it changed its name. It doesn't say anything about the kind of curriculum it might have had over an 84-year history with new headmistresses, maybe having new ideas about what should be taught here. So we don't know. But what we do know is that the school was deemed important enough and relevant enough to be handed down through generations and kept going for 84 years. So when the school started in 1657 to when the school ended in 1741 was a huge change and time of upheaval. So now after the closing of the school, Sutton House was vacant for 2 years until it was taken over by another woman, yet again, a widow named Mary Tooke. And she lived in the house as a private home for 8 years until her death in 1751. So now at this point, a man named John Cox takes control of the leaseholder and the house and forever changes its fate. So in 1752, he divides the house into 2 separate residences. So west side of the house is Milford House. And east side of the house is Ivy House. So the house will remain 2 separate dwellings and for the next 143 years until its final reunification in 1895 as the Men's Institute. So with John Cox now taking over as the leaseholder, the property is once again in the hands of men for the first time in 100 years. But only this brief time in male rule only lasted 8 years, because upon his death in 1760, the leasehold was once again in the hands of women. So first it went to his daughter, and then to her sister, and then to her sister's goddaughter, and then a chain of women having the leasehold. So that's having the leasehold. The copyhold, remember this one, sorry, just want to show again, the copyhold way up here. So this is the highest tier of ownership. So while all these women had the leasehold, the copyhold was also held by women. So young Isabella Wilson, she inherits the copyhold from her father in 1781 when she was only 19 years old. And I wish so much I had a portrait of her, but I've been able to find one yet so far. But 2 years after she inherited the copyhold, she marries John Ball, and she becomes Isabella Ball. So now the copyhold automatically becomes his in 1783. But because of the way she handled the property, I don't think she was in the background as much as the records make it look like she was. So her husband dies, and the copyhold reverts back to her. So if you don't count the intervening years, because she held it for another 28 years after that. So once again, back to my spreadsheet, there's Isabella. If we don't count the fact that she was married, so her name got taken off, she held the copyhold for 71 years, and that makes her the longest owner of Sutton House in its history, Isabella Ball. So now Isabella had a daughter-in-law named Mehetabel. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Mehetabel, thank you. Mehetabel Ball. And when Mehetabel becomes a widow in 1861, she's now made controlling trustee. So that, by the way, that little pink, I don't know if you can see the pink circle, but that's Sutton House just there. So now she had 2 daughters. So Mehetabel, she wants to increase the value of the property. So there's lots of lands around it at the time. There's the fields and tenant farmers and things like that. She's like, no, let's develop it. Let's start developing these lands into homes and making it more of a developed area. And she then named 2 roads that are still in Hackney today after her daughters. So not only did she name the roads after her daughters, but she named her daughters after herself and her mother-in-law. So I think that's really important. It kind of tells me the tight-knit affinity that this family had, that they were quite close, and also that their strength, that they played an active role in the management and the development of this property at a time when women were kind of expected to keep to the shadows in a sort of public way. The first buildings were these new houses, and they were granted leases at 1865, and here they are, still here today. And during this long period of copyhold, if you remember, they just have the copyhold. None of the Mehetabels or Isabellas ever actually lived at Sutton House, but this background information is important because when we get to the final heroine in my story, Eliza Temple, she was just a leaseholder, but her landlords were actually landladies, and very impressive landladies at that. So now back to the house. It was split in two, yeah? So Milford House was a boys' school, and then Ivy House over here, that stayed a private residence. And it remained a private residence until the reunification of the house in 1895. So for the rest of our story, we're just going to be concerning ourselves with the fates and the fortunes of Milford House. So it was a school for girls. So Eliza and her husband were only in their 20s when they set up their school. And at first it was Milford House for schooling girls, but her husband died really quickly after that. And so she ran it as a widow under Mrs. Temple's Academy for Girls. So between 1837 and 1875, Milford House was a place where young girls became women. And what kind of school was it? So during these years, once again, frustratingly little evidence about what the school was like, or indeed Eliza herself. But there are two newspaper notices that I found, but there's no images, no personal diaries. It's all very professional. But I did uncover one golden clue into who Eliza might have been. And it's this, that she signed the first ever petition for women's suffrage back in 1866. And the signing of this was groundbreaking. And it tells me that Mrs. Temple's Academy for Girls was very different from Sarah Freeman's Academy for Ladies. So in May 66, they decided to, the women's suffrage movement decided they were finally going to bring their fight to Parliament. And this MP Mill said, hey, if you can get 100 signatures, I will bring it to you. And so the petition was printed, sent all around the nation, and then they finally got 1,049 signatures. And they brought it finally a year later, so it took 1867, and then he basically we wanted to have a reform in the right to vote, changing the word man to person. And that was his, he said, this is perhaps the only really important public service I performed in my capacity as a member of Parliament. So historians have analyzed who these women were. And they found that a lot of them were entrepreneurs and also had mistresses. And I think there's something about molding the young minds of girls that makes you think about what world to be molding them for. And the fact she would also put her name to this petition says that this is public. Your names and your addresses would be in public record. This is a very unpopular movement at the time. It was lampooned in the newspapers. And to have your name out there publicly was quite bold. And I think it's something we shouldn't dismiss, that first ever petition. So she lived here in the house with her boarders and a niece and some family and staff. There were 19 women living here and no men. So when we think of women's suffrage movement today, we mostly think of the 20th century suffragettes. And that was a political, that was very much a manifestation of the later part of the movement. It actually started way back with our original suffragists, and they were quite peaceful. They didn't ever encounter the police, and they were petitioning and working for 40 years. And when we think about what a long road that was, because you remember, that first petition was one of over 16,000 petitions. Thank you. And took another 62 years for the vote to come into effect in 1920. So the militancy becomes understandable when we think about exactly how long that road was. And had they known that, would they have maybe started sooner? Would they maybe radicalize sooner? Would they have given up? I mean, we can't say, but that is exceedingly long time to wait. I mean, these not words. And that's the thing, is there's so many words, 16,000 petitions. They're like, no, it's time for action. So we can understand the militancy of the suffragettes when we think about the fact it took them 40 years to even get to the point where they were angry enough to finally say what's going to happen now. But it didn't start really back with the suffragists, because 113 years before that, we have Mary Wollstonecraft, who's calling for the rights of women, 1792. And then since that time, other voices, both men and women, I'll say, tried 1825, 1832, 1851, kept trying, and they got nothing. So was it the 40-year fight they were tired of? Or actually was it a 113-year fight? But what if we go back further? Do we start the fight back in the 17th century? And members of the Levelers, they petitioned Parliament for the rights they were promised and never delivered after the English Civil War. That's a 245-year fight. What if we went back further than that? What if we started to count every woman who wanted to publish a pamphlet of her scientific findings in the 16th century, but was denied? What about women who were landowners in the medieval period and then were denied that right in the early modern era? How far back does the injustice go? When do we pin a calendar in moment and say, women's anger started here? So the suffragettes didn't just bloom into being in the 20th century with bricks and no backstory. They're the natural byproduct of centuries of an erosion of power of women. Right, so the church purchased it and made it into a men's institute. And this is the first time in its long history that now it's unified, but exclusively for the use of men, which is quite interesting. But, women have the last laugh because Hackney at that time, fast forward 55 years, in the 1970s, there's unemployment. Slumlords leave Hackney in a state of chaos, and a vacant and abandoned Sutton House has new life once again as the Blue House. And this is when men and women came together in an artist-squatter commune. And at this time, this is the age of Thatcherite depression, youth revolt, and young women were speaking up, breaking rules in 1980s Hackney, and Sutton House was right in the middle of it once again. Thank you.